ladies and gentlemen, dear friends and colleagues. My name is Daniel Schwammenthal. I'm the director of the AJC Transatlantic Institute, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you to this evening with Yair Lapid, the head of Israel's Yesh Atid party, in conversation with Laurence Norman, the Wall Street Journal's chief correspondent, Foreign Affairs Correspondent here in Brussels. Before we begin, though, with our main event, I owe you a small explanation. We have all asked you when you came in here today to go upstairs and to view the exhibition that we are hosting here. It was not really our intention to sort of spring that on you, but we were left without any alternative because our original plan was to display this exhibit in the European Parliament. Unfortunately, the Quaestor of the European Parliament decided against it, saying it is too controversial and that it may damage the Parliament's dignity and image. I must say I was quite surprised to hear the news that an exhibition highlighting human rights violations would in any way be considered controversial in a house that considers itself to be at the forefront of the fight for human rights and freedom of speech. And with all due respect, I would venture that not the exhibition, but its censorship, in effect, damaged the Parliament's image, at least in my view. So that's why we asked you to see it here tonight. Those who haven't done so, after the discussion, we will have a little reception, and I encourage you to see it then after the end of this program, because we have really worked very hard on it. And when I say we, these are foremost the artists, the Israeli cartoon project, who see this as part of an act of solidarity with the Iranian people. Was from the beginning supported by Yair Lapid and also by 4 good friends here in the European Parliament. I would like to recognize them, the 4 members of the European Parliament from the 4 largest political groups who wanted to host it in the European Parliament. There is Lars Adaktusson, Swedish member from the EPP, Anders Vistesen, a Danish member from ECR, here you are, Peter Neumüller, where are you, Peter? Here. S&D Hungary, and Petra Sosevicius, who are from ALDE, who unfortunately cannot be here. Enough about this. Now to our main act. May I ask Yair Lapid and Laurence Norman to take the floor, and I wish you a very good evening.
It's good to be here. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks a lot, Daniel, for the introduction. And it's a real honor to be here and to talk to Mr. Lapid and to be in front of all of you. Thank you to everyone for coming. This is about the time I usually get home and chase after my 1-year-old son on my knees, crawling around the apartment. So
wow.
It's a particularly nice change.
We'll make sure it will be as long as possible.
Mr. Lapid, you're very, very well known in Israel. You've done pretty much everything from amateur boxing to TV presenting to now being a very leading politician. Perhaps a little less known in the world. Tell us something that the world doesn't know that explains who you are and what you're about.
It's an interesting question. Okay. There's the moment. It didn't happen to me. It happened, I don't know, years before, 20-some years before I was born. It's February 1945. And my father is a 13-year-old child in the Budapest ghetto. And by that time, the Russians were approaching the city and they were bombing the city, and the Jews were led in death convoys to the Danube River. We have the Hungarian ambassador here, who's a great friend. and they were shot into the freezing water. And by that time, they were feeding off mostly the meat of horses they found on the street. And he lived in this basement, in which, I think even smaller than this one, this hall. I've been there. Not far away from the Market Bridge. And one very early morning, the Germans, along with the Hungarian fascists, came to the basement and gathered the all 600 and start marching them towards the river. And they knew that they're going to die. They're approaching their own death. And people were looking at them from high windows, knowing that they're looking at the march of the condemned. And at a certain point, a Russian airplane lowered over this convoy. And suddenly there was a tremble, and the Germans were shooting the Schmeisser machine guns into the sky, and people were yelling and screaming. And my grandma, who was there, my grandfather died in the Mauthausen concentration camp before that, pushed my father into a very small public lavatory painted in green, and she said, "You have to pee now." And it is not that easy. I mean, you're 13, it's freezing, people are shooting, you know you're going to die soon. But he was a good kid, so he did, he peed. And she came after him, she closed the door behind them. And out of this mess, the convoy left without them. And 10 minutes afterwards, from the 600 people in this convoy, 598 were dead in the freezing, inside the freezing Danube River. But my father and my grandmother, my 13-year-old child, stood there next to this public lavatory painted in green, and he was free. He could go anywhere. And, London was after the Blitz, and Paris was already liberated, if my memory serves me. And of course, I flew once from Melbourne to Perth in Australia. You fly for 6 hours, you don't see a single soul. You can drive for 3 days in the Midwest. It's only empty space. And yet, in the entire world, there was not a single spot in which my father, a 13-year-old child, could go to. So they went back to the ghetto, to the same basement, hoping only that the Russians will arrive before the next death convoy will take place. And many years later, in the late 80s, I went with my father to Budapest, and he was happy. It was the first time he came back after 40 years. My father was a big guy, so we spent most of our time in restaurants. And one day we were just strolling down the street, and suddenly he saw something, and he said, yeah, look, and he started crying. And people were carefully passing by, seeing this big man crying. He said, look. And I said, Dad, what? There's not a single soul in the street. He said, no, look. And I looked, and there was nothing there but a small public lavatory painted in green that is still there. I went to Budapest a couple of years ago. I went to see if it is still there. I'm the only person I know who's doing pilgrimage to public lavatories. And when he came to his senses, he told me, he said, look at this place, because this is where my Zionism was born. This is the place I realized I always have to have a place to go to. And if I'll ever have children, they will always have to have a place to go to. And this is why we need the State of Israel. And this is why we have created and established the State of Israel only 3 years after the war. And this is why it's a holy duty to you and your children and grandchildren to make sure Israel is safe and sound. So this is the core of everything I do this moment. I apologize, it was a much longer story than you expected, but this is my family's story and this is mine.
It's an interesting and a good answer. I want to focus, and I know you want to focus on regional and foreign policy issues, security and relations with Europe, but you are the man of the moment in Israel. So I'm going to start with a few questions on the domestic situation. I'm sure the audience would like to hear your thoughts and your views. Am I talking to the next Prime Minister of Israel? And how long has the current incumbent got in office?
Well, I don't know. On both counts. I hope so. I'm the front runner. I mean, the prime minister is of course the incumbent. Always have the advantage, and I saw him racing twice, and he's very good at it. And it's going to be a tough race. But right now, I mean, in the past couple of years or year and a half, we've been polling very close to each other. So it's probably either the prime minister or myself, which is the best answer I can give you, because I'm not into guessing, because, I mean, somehow you always turn out to be an idiot when you try to guess on those issues. About the other part of it, for those of you who followed the last 3 or 4 days, it is overwhelming. I mean, there's 2 people just signed to be how do you call state witnesses, yeah. and there's another case opening up every 12 hours, and in ways, even the political body is reacting the same way the body in the state. There's this little state of shock right now, and nobody knows exactly how to grasp what is going on. Not the journalists, everybody has to say something when they have a microphone in their hand, but nobody knows exactly how to grasp all that.
But can he survive more than a few days, more than a few weeks?
I have enough of a tough job without doing yours. Commentators should commentate on his survival chances. And besides, I feel uncomfortable, because whatever I will say now is criticism. I criticize Prime Minister Netanyahu often and on free basis in Hebrew in Israel, but opposite on foreign soil in that moment. It's a personal trouble for him, and I don't want to. Everything I will say now there's a huge chance it will come out vicious, and I don't want to be vicious to somebody who is apparently in very deep personal problems.
Let's step back a little bit. I don't want to delve too deeply in any of the myriad cases that you referred to, but there is one in which your role has been highlighted. I think you've actually testified in 2 cases, but on this case 1000 involving the gifts, my sense is that no one quite knows what it is that you told the police, and that people want to know what exactly happened. What did the Prime Minister ask you to do in terms of these tax breaks? Was it a request? Was it a demand? Was it repeated? How much pressure did he put on you? Can you just give us a little insight into what happened?
Let me put this into perspective. The police summoned me to testify on a very minor. The issue itself is not minor. My role in it was they had a story. They knew all the details. They needed me to do the V on the box on my part of it as former Minister of Finance, which I did like any citizen would have. And if it wasn't, the juicy part of it, journalistically wise, was the fact that, it's, the primary political rival of the Prime Minister also testify against him. But, and on top of this, when you are giving a testimony like this, you are asked by the police, and probably they're right doing so, not to go into details before this will go or not go to trial. He's got a hearing with the Attorney General or even before. And being a law-abiding citizen, of course, this is what I'm doing. So I cannot get into details, which makes it even more juicier for the press. But
give us a sense. Give us a sense of how much the pressure was, of what. Just give us the contours of what happened here.
Yes, that's a great idea to do this in Brussels. Get into a fight with the entire Israeli press corps, whom I said no to before.
It is a great idea.
Yes, I know but you know what? Even out of respect, of course, I will not do this on stage here or anywhere else. And besides, I don't want to jeopardize whatever it is the police is going to do with it and the Attorney General are going to do about it. So it will be irresponsible of me, and I try to be responsible, especially in weekends.
Okay. I'll move on from that. Are elections inevitable now, do you think?
Well, anyway, there's an election coming within a year, because there's no way. I mean, even the current Minister of Finance will tell you there will be no other budget. He's not going to do another budget. So it's going to be somewhere between here and the beginning of 2019. It could be very quick. It could be long and painful. Nobody knows right now. As I was telling you, I mean, right now everybody is kind of shocked with the things that happen.
And are you just traveling around to Brussels and other places and observing the situation, or are you working actively to persuade some of the members of the government, to persuade Jewish Home, to persuade Colano to maybe search out a different option, maybe pull back? Are those discussions happening?
No, listen, I've been telling them openly that when you go into politics, you cannot avoid having a voice on controversial issues. I understand, I was in government, I understand how uncomfortable it is to sit in a government when the prime minister gets into trouble, and the instinct is to pull a blanket over your head and wait for this to be over with. But this is the wrong instinct. And so I've been telling my fellows and friends, and I have great friends in this government, I've been telling them, listen, if you don't want to be in public life, don't be in public life. If you are in public life, it's something that controversial morally, before the legal issues, it's okay to say, you know what, let the court do what the court does. But you have to have a moral voice, and it has to be clear. And I'm letting you know, if you won't do it now, you will do it. You will be forced to do it later on, and shame is going to be part of it. When I came into office in 2013, I came straight from Yorkshire. I was a journalist, and then I realized I'm going to meet all those people I interviewed, but never got to talk to them behind closed doors. So I asked everybody the same question. Everybody I met, President Clinton and Tony Blair, and whoever walks into the office. I said, what advice would you give to the young you? If you were to give an advice to the to yourself in the first days in public life, what advice would you give? And the best advice I got was from John McCain, Senator John McCain, who told me, he thought about it for a second. He's a very smart man. I pray to God he will be in good health. And he said, you know what? When you're in political life, people always explain to you that you have to make small compromises in order to achieve the big thing. And then the big thing never arrives, and you are left with the bitter taste of the fact that you compromised on something you believe in. So my advice to my young self is, do not compromise on moral issues, because then there's no reason for you to stay in politics. So this is a more earthy version of this is what I've been telling my friends in government.
The security situation for Israel is complicated right now. You have Iran on the Israeli borders, pretty much, a messy situation in Lebanon, the continued difficulties and conflicts with the Palestinians. Israelis have shown a tendency to vote for generals when things are tough. You served in the army. How is this a moment, and how can you persuade Israelis that they can trust you at this time?
Well, it is not exactly about being a general. There have been a few generals in office, but maybe the two greatest leaders we had, which is David Ben-Gurion and Menachem Begin, were no generals. And you know what, even the best defense minister Israel ever had, which is Misha Arens, never served a day in his life in the army. So it is not about this. It is about strength, the ability to make decisions in real time, the ability to manage a team that will be the right team in the right place, And mostly it's about people, the Israelis wants to know that there is an awareness to the hazards and the peril that are always there. Because there's this one basic question. You know, I talk quite often with my friends here in the European Union. And they always tell me, why don't you do this about the Palestinians and that about the Palestinians? I'm sure you're going to get to it. But I keep telling them, okay, just answer me one question. What do you think will happen if for one day, 24 hours, there will be no Israeli army, there will be no IDF? It will be just us civilians surrounded by 500 million enemies, declared enemies, who has been telling the world for quite a while now that they really, really want to see us dead. So what will happen if there will be no Israeli defense forces for 24 hours? And the answer is there will be rivers of blood. And therefore, you have to make sure that the Israeli knows that you understand this as a way of living, even if you are a peace-seeking person, even if you try to listen to your friends. And I think they know this about me. And this goes back a little to the story I told you in the beginning about always having a place to go to.
You've, in an article or an interview with the Jerusalem Post in November, you took on the Prime Minister and said that he'd failed in his chief mission, that he's known as Mr. Security, but actually on security, he had failed. He had failed to stop the Iran nuclear deal. Iran was, as we said before, encroaching towards the borders of Israel and Israel's friendship, even in the United States, with at least part of the Democratic Party, have been made more fragile. I'm curious, what would a Lapid government have done differently over the last 2 or 3 years?
Well, here's a few basic, again, I mean, I don't want to be too critical about the Prime Minister, especially not now. It's not done. The British, right? It's a British expression, it's not done. I think, so I don't want to go technical, but I will say this: we need to have a more functional foreign ministry, because there is no foreign minister now, and hasn't been one for 3 years. I think we need to go back to being a bipartisan issue in the United States. I mean, President Trump is a great friend. Every Israeli in his right mind appreciated what he did about Jerusalem. And yet, the political circle being where it is, you have to make sure that Israel, as it was for the last 69 years, will be a bipartisan issue in the United States. You know what? There's going to be a midterm election in November. There might be a Democratic House. Do you want to be in trouble with the Democratic House? No, it's not a great idea. There are places for improvement here in the EU, which the Israelis feel a bit, not a bit, even more than a bit, upset with the voices coming out from the EU, and yet this is our main trade partner, and relations should be maintained. So there's a lot, I mean, foreign policy, there's a lot of work to be done. I will say this: there are 7 arenas. If you look at the Israeli interest, there are 7 arenas. There's the American arena, then there's the EU, then there's the international establishments, United Nations, so on and so forth, Civil Human Rights Council, that has become the Terror Rights Council. You have Russia, you have China. Russia, when you look at the role it takes in Syria, it's problematic for us. The fact that they are allowing, in ways, the Iranians to have boots on the ground south of Damascus is problematic. You have China, who's becoming quite rapidly the biggest trade partner of Iran. You got the Middle East, and then you got the rest of the world. No offense, but in terms of Israeli interests, it is number 7. So you just have to do a better job in coordinating and working on this as one issue that supports Israeli interests. And I think Israel has not done what is necessary in the last few years.
Let's imagine, which is quite possible now, that you're Prime Minister on May the 12th of this year.
On May the 12th?
May the 12th, I'll
Okay.
come to it. President Trump must make a decision on that day as to whether he extends the waivers for the sanctions connected to the nuclear deal. If there are no fixes to the deal at that point, even if discussions are still going on with the Europeans as they've started, would you advise him to scrap the deal, or would you advise him to keep it in place?
Well, I campaigned shoulder to shoulder with the Prime Minister against the JCPOA. I think it's a bad deal. I think it do not even answer some of the question if you look inside the deals, like things like the supervision or the 24 days alarm that the Iranians have before anyone comes in to see what they're doing, what is it that they do, and so on and so forth. What bothers me, actually, and you know what, it's not a very popular notion, not here, not in Russia, not in China, and even if the American president will not sign the waiver, this deal was not made only by the Americans. It's called the P5+1, meaning there are 5 others. And the Chinese, the Russians, the Europeans already announced that they're not going to nix it. So I will point to something else. My biggest problem right now is the fact that the deal has made Iran kosher on other issues that are crucial not only to Israel, but to the security of the entire world. All of a sudden, nobody speaks about the fact that Iran has a ballistic missile program, the fact that Iran is the biggest sponsor of terror in the world, supports Hezbollah, the biggest terror organization in the world, the fact that Iran is a total complicit to the massacre of 500,000 people in Syria, and the biggest violator of human rights, hence this exhibition in the world. So I keep telling my European and American friends, okay, you have signed a deal that I don't like. Explain to me how is it possible that here in the EU, and this is part of the reason I came to Brussels this time, Hezbollah's policy wing, so to speak, is not recognized as part of a terror organization, while even Sheikh Nasrallah, the head of Hezbollah, is saying, yes, it is part of the terror organization. It is one organization. There's no military wing and policy wing. It is something we've been selling around to the Europeans, and then they laugh because the Europeans are buying into it. And this is not only a symbolic issue. If Hezbollah is recognized, fully recognized as a terror organization, it makes it easier to track the money. And tracking terror money is a very effective way of stopping terror. This is all Iranian-based, Iranian plans, Iranian bases, Iranian plans, Iranian doctrines. And the world is saying, yeah, but we've signed the JCPOA and we're so happy about it, so we're not going to do anything about anything else. And this is wrong, and this should be discussed more.
But I want to come back to the question I asked you. But there are 2 arguments on what Trump should do. One says he promised to kill the deal. People think it's a bad deal. You think it's a bad deal. Let's get rid of it. Mm-hmm. The other says if you get rid of it, Iran starts up its program again. We know how far they got with their program. And a nuclear-armed Iran is even more dangerous in the region than an unarmed Iran. So what should the president do? He will call you up.
Yeah, I know.
I'm sure he will.
I know.
So what should
And the
he do?
answer will be, we have to get everyone around the same table before making this decision. I mean, even I don't want to say, I mean, I'm as hawkish as Prime Minister Netanyahu is on this issue. So if you ask him, he's not even him, he doesn't speak about nixing it anymore, because I would tell the president, listen, we have to gather the P5+1 once again and tell them we have to go back to square one, telling them, you know what? The mistake that was made is the fact that the sanctions worked. The sanctions were the most effective tool in order to stop the Iranian nuclear program. But right now, if the president is asking the question, the answer is, don't do anything unilaterally. Let's see if we can gather everybody around. This time, let's get the Israelis involved, because they know more about what is really going on in Iran. I'm part of Israel's subcommittee of secret services and intelligence, but it's not a secret. So we know what's going on, and maybe you should hear about this, but make this into a multilateral move instead of just signing a waiver unilaterally.
So just to press you on that, if you need to kill it, but don't kill it right now. Bring together.
Don't kill it. Don't try to kill it by yourself, because then you're going to have the worst of all worlds, meaning everyone else, the other five, will do business with Iran. Money will go into Tehran, but they will be liberated of the necessity to restrain themselves on the nuclear program. So we get the worst of all worlds, and we don't want this.
The Prime Minister has set some pretty sweeping red lines about Iran's involvement in Syria. I was in Munich on Sunday, heard him speak there, and he repeated a message he said a number of times in the last few months. No military bases, no air bases, naval bases, no military infrastructure close to the Israeli border. He's talked about precision missile factories both in Syria and in Lebanon. There are some voices in Israel who say, that's a lot of demands. Of course, we would rather the Iranians weren't there at all, but don't box ourselves in. Don't set too many red lines that we might be forced to go and act on. What would your red lines be on Iran's involvement in Syria?
There cannot be an Iranian military presence in Syria. This is a threat not only to Israel, but to the world. And I don't know, think of it this way. Think of very friendly, I don't know, the United Kingdom and Ireland, okay? Can you imagine? I mean, and I chose not only because you're English, but also because there's a history there, okay? Now imagine there were 140,000 accurate missiles all of a sudden in the Irish border aimed at London. Would the UK accept this? And on top of this, you will have Iranians, I don't know, on the Scottish border. Because this is what is really happening. Now, the Iranians, ask yourself, people need to ask themselves a very simple question. Why is it that the Iranians want to have a military presence in Syria? And the answer is Israel. And the answer is destabilizing the region. Because this is what this regime has been talking about since the day Ayatollah Khomeini went down from the plane. So it's not like they suddenly appeared out of the blue sky. They got involved in the Syrian civil war. They are responsible for the killing of 500,000 people and the fact that 11 million other millions have lost their homes. Europe is suffering from this severely. And what they wanted was to be able to spread the revolution. So Israel will not tolerate. And when I'm saying will not tolerate, this means using all possible means. Military presence of Iran, regular military presence of Iran in Syria, because there's only one reason they want to have this presence, and this is to jeopardize the citizens of Israel.
So are you also talking about military bases? I mean, there has been an Iranian presence in Syria for many, many, many years, even before the civil war, and we know that Hezbollah have a very strong presence. It seems that the Israeli focus in recent months has been on the south, has been a presence near to the border. I just want to be clear where that trigger point, where Israel must feels it must intervene is, in your eyes?
Yeah, I know that you want to be clear about this, but part of deterrence is the fact they do not know. They do know we will react, and we're going to do physical things if we think it's necessary. Look at what happened just, I don't know, it was 10 or 12 days ago. An Iranian drone penetrated the Israeli sky, which means penetrated Israel's sovereignty. It was activated from the T4 airport, which is a Syrian base. So you have an Iranian, I don't know, caravan, so to speak, standing in a Syrian base. They use facilities, Syrian facilities, but still it is an Iranian drone who's penetrating our sovereignty and space. And the reason they do it is because they always progress. They always check the borders. They always push the envelope just a little more, just a little more, just a little more. And our answer is, you must know we will react unproportionally. The reaction will not be proportional. The reaction will be unproportional. And I'm telling you on this, it's across the board, opposition, coalition alike. So what I'm going to tell, it's not as accurate or exact as you asked me, but the answer is, how are we going to react? Unproportionally. Because there are too many things that we have announced that are no-go for us. And you cannot have deterrence if you're painting red lines and then do nothing about it. So they know our red lines. And if they look at the history of the region, they know Israel was capable throughout the years to do something which is almost impossible, which is maintaining international law and morals on one hand, and yet react in an unproportional way when we felt the red lines have been crossed. Part of what we do as a democracy is saying, here's our red lines. Sometimes we say it out loud. Sometimes we just make sure they know. And then if somebody is crossing them, we're going to react in an unproportional way. This is the way we've been doing things for 70 years, almost 70 years. And it is not inevitable, but there's a big question about the other players who are involved. We were very upset that after the Iranian drone and the Israeli reaction, the Russians have said, they condemned the violation of the Syrian sovereignty without saying a word about Israeli sovereignty. It was
although they didn't deploy the S-400s to the S-4000s to hit any of the Israeli aircraft.
Yeah, well, excuse me for not being thankful. We have a deconfliction mechanism with the Russians that is functional, and it was created exactly for these purposes. We're not going to ask permission from the Russians to do what we need to do in terms of our national security, but the deconfliction mechanism is important. We don't want to hurt any Russian soldiers, for example. But the Russians the main goal of the Russians right now is to stabilize Syria. The Russians are in for a long, long time. It's not a visit. I think it was a Russian dream since the 19th century to have a harbor in the Mediterranean. Now they have one. They're not going to give it up. It's okay. We understand this, but the Russians need to understand that there will be no stabilized Syria with Iranian military presence, and President Assad needs to know that he will have no ability to stabilize his own chair while there is an Iranian military presence in Syria. And on top of this, we have been trying to convince our American friends that their absence from the arena is bad for everybody. I think the United States has, you know what, even in terms of organizational memory, understands that if you are trying to avoid those kind of trouble, it will come back to you in a much worse version. So, and Americans are now getting more and more involved in Syria, even though if it's in the northern western part of Syria. And they need to be part of any future solution of the situation we have on our hands right now.
Let me press you briefly on Russia. Has Israel become a little too dependent on Russia in the neighborhood? Does it worry you, the amount of influence that Russia seems to have, not just in Syria, in Egypt, in Libya, in other places? Is that something that should worry an Israeli leader?
Well, it is to be taken into account. It is what it is. This is, I mean, there's no vacancy on geopolitical world, and the Russians have interests, and the Russians are, and this is quite all right. The Russians are taking care of Russian interests, and they will, and their ability, they have sometimes even admirable ability to manipulate everybody into a situation. Which is well, probably what diplomacy is about, and while using a very little force. As long as it is helpful, it's okay.
But you don't fear that Russia will be more prone to limit or try to limit Israel's ability to act than America, for example?
Well, let me put it this way. I don't know, a month ago, Henry Kissinger came to Israel for a visit, and I went to have coffee with him. He's 94 years old. He's still sharper than anyone else. And I asked him a question. I said, you know what? I said, 55 years ago, you came here as, he was at the time, I think, President Kennedy's geopolitical young, smart advisor. Because every American president always wanted to have a smart Jew next to him.
Including the current one.
Yes. And if he's got three of them, actually, Greenblatt, Friedman, and Kushner. Anyway, so I said, and a young journalist came to interview you, and he asked you a question. The question was, do you think Israel can count on the United States or Russia, because at the time, for its national security, or it can only count on itself? And Kissinger looked at me and said, who was the young journalist? I said, my dad. And he said, what did I answer? And I said, you said that Israel can only count on itself. And he thought about it for a second and said, same answer. Israel, not only that Israel can only count on itself, Israel is not going to ask permission from nobody on earth to protect its national security. This is the basic rule of the way we've been handling things since the creation of Israel. And this is, you know what, I don't want to play the guilt card, but this is also one of the conclusions we have from the Holocaust. We're going to determine our destiny by ourselves.
Let's come to the Middle East peace process, as you knew I would ask about it. President Abbas gave a speech yesterday at the United Nations. I mean, some of the things he said there sounded a little bit like some of the things you've said in the past. I mean, he said he wants an international conference sometime by the middle of 2018, a freeze on the settlements. He talked about a regional agreement that I know you've talked about, and he talked about a solution that is two-state-based, includes some minimum level of land swaps, security, and a just solution for refugees. I'm sure you quibble on some of those points, but it's not massively different from what you've said in the past. again, let's say you're Prime Minister in 2 or 3 months' time. Is that the basis to sit down and have serious negotiations?
Well, first of all, I also listened to President Abbas's speech, and he's got this quite amazing ability to talk the talk without walking the walk. Not to mention the fact that he has a tendency to give very different speeches in English and in Arabic. This is not what he's telling his people. And you know what? Let me use this opportunity and say something to the European Union on this one. Now you represent the European Union, whether you like it or not.
I'm a Brit.
Yeah, I know. Well, you're still in for a few months, right? So the thing is here, there's a lot of Europeans who are upset or very upset about the settlements. I don't necessarily agree 100%, but I understand. Okay, it's a point of view. And you know what? And I do believe there's a possibility that someone will criticize Israel's settlement policies. I do sometimes myself, while being a great friend of Israel. What bothers me is the fact that everybody became so a lot of people, not everybody, became so focused on the settlements that they tend to turn a blind eye to everything else the Palestinians are doing. Especially the fact that the Palestinians do not seem to be capable of taking their necessary responsibility for nation building. In the last 2 decades, 3 times they were offered more than 90% of the territories, and they said no because for them it's a zero-sum game. Either you give us whatever we want, or we're not doing anything, which is an absurdity. And I can't think of any nation on earth that has been created 100%. I mean, Israel was created with only 55% of its current territory, and the United States was created with 13 states, and modern Italy was created without Rome. And if they were really into peacemaking, they would say, okay, we're taking the 95% and we want you to know that we're still disagreeing with you on few, I don't know, subjects. So this is one. Number 2 is people ask us to ignore what happened in 2005. But we cannot, because you know what? It's almost a national trauma. In 2005, the disengagement, Israel did whatever our friends have ever asked us to do. We left Gaza. We dismantled the settlements. We sent the army away. We even left them with 3,000 greenhouses for them to start building an economy. Instead, they demolished the 3,000 greenhouses. They built training camps for the Islamic Jihad and Hamas. Less than a year later, they voted Hamas into power. And ever since, fired more than 15,000 rockets and missiles on Israeli citizens. So, what we've been telling the Palestinians is, do you understand how desperately we need a proof from you? It's on you, it's not on us. That Israel will be secured after an agreement, whatever agreement it will be signed. And this is something that must be on you, and this is something the European Union should push the Palestinians on. They should, I mean, every friend of both nations should be able to tell the Palestinians, listen, you need to stop victimizing yourself. You need to stop talking about invented refugees, because there were only 750,000 refugees in 1948. This is not my number, this is UNRWA number, this is UN number. And you'll have to understand that the Palestinians cannot be the only nation on earth that they can inherit the statue of a refugee, even third generation. You can be born in the 3rd floor in the Quartier Latin in Paris or in a villa in Dubai and still be considered a Palestinian refugee. This cannot be that all the responsibility is on the Israelis who have all the reasons in the world to say, you didn't prove to us yet that our security will be secured after the agreement. If this happens, then we can start the long, painful journey towards the two-state solution. And all I've said now is not coming from a right hawkish settler. I am a devoted supporter of the two-state solution. I believe it is still the only reasonable, possible, valid solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
But Mr. Lapid, you know as well as I do, I mean, security is something that will be part of any serious negotiations. It's always been very clear that that's the case. Even Abbas in his speech talked about it yesterday. I guess the question is, if you become Prime Minister in the next few weeks, will it be a priority for you to re-energize peace talks? Maybe it's not for a complete deal. You've talked about a partial deal. But will it be a priority for you?
First of all, if I'm becoming a Prime Minister in a few weeks, what am I doing in Brussels? Yes, of course. I think it's an Israeli interest. Because I am an Israeli patriot. So the core reason for everything I do is what is good for Israel. And the best thing for Israel, the best thing for my country, for my people, for my children, is for us to separate from the Palestinians. Now, I don't think in my lifetime we're going to have a European-like peace. There will no be. We're not going to have the German, French. I mean, I remember when I was younger and I used to drive listen, first of all, you were driving Germany, then you hit the wall. And then you would drive, and one day came and you drove from Berlin to Paris and you realized you didn't cross any border. So, okay, right now it seems like a pipe dream to Israel. So, but I think if I'll be Prime Minister and I will be able to make the first, not step, but steps towards a separation from the Palestinians in which, and I will not negotiate it here in terms of the details, but in which there will be, on one side, an independent Palestinian state, and on the other side, an Israeli state, as the state of Israel. Hopefully, not hopefully, necessarily unsymmetrical in terms of military force due to the history that we know. Hopefully, and on this room, this city, Europe should be a player, the first Arab democracy, and the first Arab democracy that doesn't vote in immediately a terror organization into power, as it happened before in Gaza, when the Islamic Brotherhood came into power in Egypt and so on and so forth. So and it has to be a very careful journey, but if you ask me about my own motive, I think this is a debt I have to my children to do something about it.
And is that a set of aims, is that a negotiation you believe you could have with Abbas and the Palestinian Authority?
That's a big question. There is a possibility that, let's say it very carefully, both current leaders on both sides are not perfect candidates to do something dramatic for very different reasons. President Abbas is 83 years old. He's smoking like a chimney. And yeah, probably very good genes. And he's an old school PLO kind of guy. So, and the Palestinians all keeps telling us, you know what, he's the last of this generation, and therefore he's the last of the people who are capable to do a great move. But the former example we have is Yasser Arafat, who was offered, you know what, way more than I'm willing to give. And during the Clinton administration, in the Camp David meetings with Prime Minister Barak, including things in Jerusalem that are unthinkable to me. And instead of saying yes, opened the first intifada that caused the life of so many people. So I think...
It sounds like the jury's out. You're not quite sure on Abbas.
I am not quite sure on Abbas, but I do realize that it is not, the late Yitzhak Rabin used to say that it's a pity we don't have a conflict with the Norwegians. Because with the Norwegians, we know how to cut a deal. You're making peace only with enemies, otherwise it is unnecessary to make peace. So I understand, and I've been going back and forth with our Prime Minister about this because he keeps saying there's no partner, and I'm saying there is never a partner. It's never going to be something or someone we have chose. It's going to be someone we don't like. This is why we need to have a firm agreement with firm security measurements.
Let me just finally ask a couple of questions on relations between Europe and Israel. You touched on this earlier. It's always rocky, particularly between the EU and Israel. They've been kind of constantly bickering at each other. Is it entirely the fault of the EU?
Yes, of course. It is, well, first of all, we have to always differentiate between people and establishments. There is a notion within the EU that we're not doing enough, especially on the settlements. There is a notion within Israel that nobody in the EU seemed to remember that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict didn't start with the settlements. The settlements only started actually in the 70s. And they were trying to kill us way before that. Haj Amin al-Husseini went to Berlin to meet with Hitler and discuss the possibility of importing the final solution to Israel, or to Palestine at the time. And they were killing Jews since the 20s. So it is not only about the settlements. And again, but on top of this, I think we need to be able to realize that basically this is not a bad relations. There's a bad vocabulary because politicians, we always have your base, and politicians talk to their base. But it is a very functional relations trade-wise. These are very close cultures. Culturally, Israel is more than anything part of Europe. We're not, by instinct, we're not, thank you. We are more of Europeans than Americans. In terms of democratic tradition, we are very similar. So and we have disputes and disagreements, and there's bitterness on both sides, but it is still within the family. Our Western Europe, traditionally. And also in terms of the volume of the business we do. And we need to do a better job in promoting. I was in Paris just before the French election, and I met with Macron discussing this, with President Macron, discussing this. There's so many things we can still do together. And now, there's something every politician around the globe knows, is that sometimes, in order to bridge all sorts of disagreements, you need to lower your vocabulary. And this hurts you in your own political background. But this is what leadership is about. Leadership is not, or almost never is, opposite the enemy. Opposite the enemy, you need to have good generals. Leadership is about telling your people the things they don't want to hear. And this is what we sometimes need to do more in order to maintain these really, really important relations we have with Europe. Europe is 34% of our trade. It's our main market. Even the famous Israeli startup nation is aimed more at Europe than other markets. I'll give you an example. Israel was never involved in car industry. we're just too little to, you don't have assembly lines of Toyota in Israel. But Israel right now have 450 startups that are dealing with autonomous cars. So this is the things we are checking and collaborating here. So it is so important that even if you are going to be hit a little in your political base, it is worth the effort.
Great. Let's take some questions from the audience. Do we have lots of hands up? If that's okay with you, I'll take question and then answer, because it's always frustrating when there are three or four. If that's all right.
Who's going to write the question? You or I? So give me a paper and I will write down the questions.
Yeah, of course. Anyone have a question to ask? Otherwise, I have another 5 I can ask. But so no, please go ahead.
Yes, thank you. You said you wouldn't give many details on any possible...
Can you raise your hand for a second?
Yeah, can you please identify yourself as well?
Sorry. Alexander Lungarov, I'm an EU official. And I was wondering, you mentioned any possible new negotiations with the Palestinians, and you wouldn't want to give any new details. But as I understand, your party's line is that major settlement blocks like Ariel, Gush Etzion, and Ma'ale Adumim would remain within Israel. Now, the EU's policy or line would be that all land swaps wouldn't be negotiated, which would also be the Palestinian side, I guess. How are you going, or how would you be selling this to any international or European audience? Thanks.
And let's maybe take one more question. If anyone has one, no? Otherwise...
Sure. They are so overwhelmed by your brilliant style of interviewing. They do not dare to ask another question.
Your answers,
yes.
Clearly.
Okay, first of all, I think the most important thing in terms of negotiation is define the mechanism of negotiating. Since the Oslo Accords, which is mid-90s, early 90s, there were 11 rounds of bilateral talks with the Israelis and Palestinians. All came out, I was deeply involved in the last one, I was part of the negotiating team. All came out to the same nothing. I was sitting there in a room, it was tired people who were saying the same tiring things to each other for 20 years. So it became clear to me that the first thing we need to do is determine the mechanism that will enable the dynamics of the negotiation. I will get to the territories itself in a second. And this is why in September of 15, I have presented the Israeli people with this idea of regional conference, with all the players who are involved anyhow. You cannot discuss the future of Gaza without the Egyptians, because the Egyptians had a border with Gaza. You cannot discuss the freedom of religion in Jerusalem without talking about with Jordan and the Saudis, who are traditionally the custodians of the religious sites in Jerusalem. And you cannot discuss the creation of the Palestinian state without the people who are supposed to finance it, which are the Gulf countries in Saudi, maybe with the exception of Qatar. So what we need to do is to have all those people around the same table. Now, it's not as easy as it sounds, because there's another theory. And the theory says you don't gather the leaders into the same room. This is what diplomats always tell you. Unless you know what the end result will be, because otherwise you might come to a much worse result. So, and my answer to this is, then why do we need leaders? We need leaders exactly for this, to go into the room in which no one else was capable or able to solve the problem. And so we need to start, so you can imagine this as 3 tables. One Israeli-Palestinian table, because you have to have bilateral talks. One Israeli-Arab table that will discuss water, counterterrorism, so on and so forth. And in the middle, some sort of a P5+1 table that will be moderating the whole thing. It is doable. It's a more efficient or a bit more complex version of what they tried to do in the Madrid conference for those of us who are old enough to remember. And from there to start the march. Now it's a long march, and yes, the big blocks are going to stay, and yes, it's more than possible, and these maps has been drawn 20 times of the swaps, necessary swaps. And you know what? Yes, there will be no agreement on Jerusalem and on the refugees. And therefore, you need to know that right now, what we need to achieve is just, in ways, an upgraded conflict. Between two states, it will be the two-state solution, and these two states will have only a partial agreement, not a final agreement between them. Because they're going to say, but we never gave up on our dream on Jerusalem, and we will tell them, you know what, we dreamed about Jerusalem and for 3,000 years, the clock has just started ticking for you too. Because no Israeli in his right mind will ever divide Jerusalem for the same reason the Brits will not divide London and the French will not divide Paris. So it's going to be, we need, through a regional conference, start the long march towards the two states with a partial agreement, with disagreement on a lot of issues. But if there's one issue I think, and everyone who's been involved in this think, there are more than possible solutions, it is drawing the border that leaves the big blocks of settlements within Israel, and compromising, which is a painful compromise, on the more isolated settlements. For me, it's just on the emotional part of it. This is the land of the prophets. This has been Israel throughout history. This is the land of Jeremiah and Isaiah and Ezekiel, and it hurts me to see this in other hands, but I understand this as the price of Israel staying a Jewish democratic state, a state with a solid Jewish majority and solid democratic values.
Do we have any other questions? Yeah, there's a lady here in the second row. Can you perhaps wait for a microphone if we have one for the lady here? Thanks.
Hi, my name is Dania. I'm from Israel.
And we both traveled all the way here.
All the way here
just
to listen to you speak,
okay.
Which was really terrific. Thank you so much for coming. So I was wondering, in a scenario where there will be elections soon and Yesh Atid will rise to power and receive the majority of seats in the parliament, how do you vision a coalition head by you in terms of political vision, way, and maybe even the composition of parties?
I'm going to take my time on this because unlike anyone else here, she votes. And therefore, she is really important to me.
3 minutes.
Well, listen, I've been discussing this for quite a while now. And I've been saying that if Yesh Atid will win the next election, what we're going to try and form is a coalition with Labour and Likud, meaning a center-right, center-left coalition. Now, nobody's particularly happy with the concept because those who are voting Labour hates Likud and those who vote Likud hates Labour. And yet, we need a mandate coming from the center-right to march forward on the peace process. And more than anything, and I think you and I feel this, even if it doesn't say anything to anyone else here, it's time for unity. Israel was subjected to the politics of fear and anger for too long. And not only Israel. I mean, you see quite a bit of politics of fear and anger in Europe and the United States as well. But there is a backlash, and there is now so many people who feel uncomfortable about this and understand that fear and anger should belong in protest movements, but it's a very bad way of running countries with real people and real problems. So Yesh Atid, Likud, a Labour government, and then you can ask everybody else to join, but basically this should be the base of some sort of a unity government which will enable us to do more and to progress on policy issues and also on the issues that matters to your generation, like housing and domestic issues, which are not that interesting to this crowd because they have their own problems, but I think is crucial in terms of the kind of hope a young person should have looking at his country. And to see a government that says, okay, we're putting aside what differentiates us for what unites us is a very good sign to me to give to the young Israelis that I care about. I know it's the worst cliche of all, and yet cliches are upgraded to become cliches because there's something truthful in them. And the cliche is you do it because I do it because I have 3 children in Israel. And otherwise, why be in this? I was making more money doing what you're doing. Charlie Rose interviewed me in New York, and it was allowed to speak to Charlie Rose at the time. And he asked me about the move from journalism, from television mostly, to politics. And I said, you know what? I'm making about 1/4 of what I used to make. I'm working at least 5 times hard. But at least everybody hates me.
He wasn't a print journalist. He's in TV.
Yes, okay, I agree. So this is the kind of government we want to have, and I think it's doable.
Let's take one last question, if we may. There's the gentleman who stood up is obviously very keen to have a question.
So it's going to be 2 questions because somebody already got a hold of
Okay,
the
can you ask them together? That's fine. That's great.
So I actually had 2 questions. My first one was going to be about coalitions, so I'm glad that was asked. And the other one is picking up on your closing words in response to the first question, which is you mentioned Jewish and democratic Israel. I was going to ask about your party's and your personal views on the debate that's currently happening in Israel on the nation-state or the proposed nation-state bill. What you see happening there, whether the word democratic will be included, and what you kind of see as a timeline for that. And I didn't introduce myself. I'm Kirsten Youngberg from working for the European Parliament.
And can we take the second question from the gentleman who stood up?
Thanks a lot. I'm Roland Freudenstein from the Wilfried Martens Center, which is the think tank of the European People's Party. And I want to come back to the question of the Iranian nuclear program, which I think everyone, even in this town, admits exists and continues to exist. But you know, most people in Brussels would say, we know the JCPOA is imperfect. We know that we're just kicking the can down the road, but we're at least slowing it down. And we hope that in the meantime, in the next 5 or 10 years, something will happen in Iran that will, the moderates will take over and so on. So the regime will change from within. So what would you answer to this set of arguments in the European institutions? What are the actual alternatives to kicking the can down the road and relying on Rouhani to change the country?
Thanks.
Well, on the first question, there are a few versions of the state-nation bill, and we have presented the Israeli Knesset with one of them that was actually written originally by Benny Begin, who's the son of Menachem Begin, the late Menachem Begin, who is a member of Likud, because I wanted to use him as a tool to an end, and the end was to say Israel not only can but must be a Jewish democratic state, and a Jewish democratic state is tested first and foremost by the way it treats minorities. This is our test as people, as a nation. And therefore, if we're going to fight in all our possible parliamentary tools against any bill that puts Jewish state over democratic state. There is a tension there. The tension is actually philosophical, because if you are saying a country is ethnic-based, how can it be totally democratic? If only Jews are allowed to immigrate to Israel, how can you tell yourself that you're a pure democracy? And the answer is, there is no answer. The answer is the founding fathers of Israel realized that there is a tension there, but they have trusted us to be able to maintain this tension while maintaining our principal values. And making this, I mean, it's like an ongoing pain. I mean, there's an ongoing pain in trying to balance the Jewish nature of Israel and the democratic nature of Israel. And to me, people who are trying to say, you know what, let's get over with this, and let's just have one piece of legislation so we can forget about this. They are jeopardizing the spirit of the nation, or the core idea of what Israel is all about. And because the translation is complicated on a daily basis. I'll give you, I mean, when Israel was established, and as I was saying, it was 3 years after the Holocaust, it had with it two very contradicting principles. One is survival. We cannot not have a place to go to. We need to survive in all costs. There will be no other Holocaust, and nobody's going to come for the rescue. We do not trust the word. I apologize, but we have too much experience, and we do not trust anyone but ourselves. But there's another conclusion coming from the Holocaust. Moral people are only tested in immoral times. And then you have to balance those two, and it translates to a young Israeli officer standing in Gaza while somebody's shooting at him from the kindergarten. If you shoot back, you might hit a kid. If you don't shoot back, your soldiers are gonna get hurt and die. And everyone who thinks there's a textbook solution to this do not understand the complexity of being a country like Israel. So having a nation-state bill like the one they're trying to write right now, to me is disastrous, and we're going to oppose it in any possible means.
And very quickly on Iran.
Yes. On Iran, well, the answer is we have, if it was up to us, we would have told the world what we told the world before. Go back to the sanctions. The sanctions were working, A, to slow down the nuclear program, and B, to undermine or to eat slowly into this horrible, horrible regime that should have had its own people rising up against them years ago. I mean, you just look at what happened to, I don't know, the LGBT community, women, just people who believe in human rights. So the sanctions were the right thing to do, and this is what's painful about what happened in the JCPOA. I agree with you, it is more than anything the lack of patience coming from what seems to us every now and then here in the Middle East, a bit spoiled world who ask for immediate solutions to problems that are not immediate. So the sanctions was and still are the best possible way of treating this.
Thank you very much.
This is a British dramatic...
I'm waiting for Daniel to come to the stage.
Well, first of all, a round of applause for this really fascinating and interesting discussion. And thank you all for coming. We have a little reception prepared for you downstairs. And for those who have time and haven't seen it yet, please go upstairs and check out this very controversial exhibition. Thank you very much for coming and for your interest, and have a good night.